Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a Undercolor of Law hot take on executive orders, how Trump plans to use them, and what the dangers are. So the Trump regime, the incoming one, loves to brag about how much they're going to do on day one. Trump always talks about that. He wants to be a dictator on day one. And interestingly enough, a little bit of a common theme there between being a dictator and using executive orders. Because what is an executive order? They're a way of doing business for the executive branch. That's how the CEO of the branch, the president, gives guidance to agencies without having to wait for Congress to pass all these minutiae of laws on how to regulate everything and how to implement everything. Now, there's something called the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's what those regulations do. And so for Trump and other presidents to want to get those agencies moving, they'll sometimes use something called the executive order. And it's not really explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, but it flows from the executive's powers in the Constitution. And it's a way of avoiding the slowness of Congress, which has to introduce the bill, pass it in both houses, and get the president to sign it. And it can also be a fast way, not just an efficient way, to get around Congress when speed's really super necessary or if there's a crisis. Now, there are downsides to that, as we're going to talk about, but for example, the Emancipation Proclamation was actually an executive order. Lincoln's famous action to free the slaves in 1863, good luck with him trying to get that passed through Congress at that time. He just proclaimed it. Similarly, in 1948, after World War II, President Truman desegregated the military using an executive order. Kind of ironic, it's after World War II, after so many of the minority troops had fought for the country, then they get around to desegregating it. But again, he did that through a proclamation, not having to pass it through Congress. And in 1957, President Eisenhower ordered the Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School desegregated, a very famous action, which in some ways signaled the real public awareness of the civil rights movement, which had actually been being worked on by advocates for a long time before then. But that was kind of the public's first real big introduction to that. Now, the executive orders definitely have limitations. They have big ones. They are not an unmitigated power on the part of the president. They can be challenged in court as being unconstitutional. They can also be completely undone wholesale by the next president, who can just say, we're rescinding all of these orders. But they are a very powerful, fast-acting, and therefore dangerous tool, because the court challenges take time. The executive action doesn't take much time. And certainly with this expected slew of orders that the Trump regime is going to do, there are preparations at the state level, advocacy groups ready to stop these orders, ready to challenge them in court. We're going to keep you updated on those and share with you resources in which you can help track those. Resources like this one that Just Security has done, which is their American Autocracy Threat Tracker. That's something to keep for your saved favorite links to take a look at that, and we will certainly keep an eye on that and tell you about it too. The incoming Trump regime knows time is short. They're already a lame duck administration, right? He can't run for re-election. And Susan Wiles, his incoming chief of staff, has said to conservative groups, there's really only 2 years in which to do things. They're worried about the upcoming midterms too, not 4. And you hear that in how fast they're naming people already, how quickly they want to continue to reinforce the idea of what they're going to do on day one. And listen to some of the hysterical energy exhibited here by Stephen Miller, who, among other things, is the shaper of Trump's entire immigration mindset. Take a listen here.
Upon taking office, President Trump will issue a series of executive orders and actions that will suspend the entry of illegal aliens into this country, and will begin the process of dismantling the criminal organizations that have been preying upon our nation and its citizens, and of course carrying out the largest domestic deportation operation in U.S. history.
And so you'll see that as Miller rants here, he starts to get really worked up. Actually, the anchor, even Laura Ingraham, looks a little bit uncomfortable. They kind of cut away from him for a moment. You know, the way that he has this sort of building hysteria reminds me of many authoritarian zealot speakers. As they talk, they get more and more energized, more enamored of their own voices and the thrill of getting to mouth out their hatred and zealousness. So you'll see that it gets a little bit awkward when people go off like that, even on Fox. But later, you'll hear him talk about the invoking of Article 2 as the commander-in-chief powers, putting the world on notice. Just take another listen to the end of this clip here.
Everything in the world is going to change on January 20th because the President of the United States is going to use every single legal, diplomatic, and financial tool to halt the entry of all illegal aliens into this country. There will be no benefits, there will be no entry, there will be no asylum, there will be no admission. You may be prosecuted, you will certainly be arrested, and you will absolutely be deported. The entire world, Mexico, Northern Triangle, Central America, South America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, will get this message. There is no unlawful route to enter the United States of America. Every presidential authority, including his absolute authority under Article 2 to defend the territorial sovereignty of the United States, will be used, from the Department of Defense to the Department of Justice to Homeland Security and every single other lawful authority at his disposal. It will be the end of the evasion. It will be the beginning of the liberation.
Well, Stephen, it's always great to have you on. Thank you very much.
I'm very struck by how he wants to conclude this by saying, this is the end of the invasion and the beginning of the liberation. But like so many things authoritarians say, the truth is really just the opposite, right? For the MAGA vision is really the beginning of the invasion. It's the invasion of our civil rights and the end of liberation. And let's remind ourselves, it's a good time to do it, of a very infamous Executive Order 9066. We all know this history that on a long ago Sunday in December 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and brought the U.S. into World War II. Now that was a fundamental crisis for any country, a physical attack on its own soil, killing thousands, pulling the country into a world war. Like all crises, it created a stress test for the system of government, for our democracy. And at least in one way, we failed. Despite reports that included one from the U.S. Army intelligence that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast posed no threat to national security in the event of a Japanese invasion, which was pretty unlikely. In fact, newly revealed intelligence has shown that both Japan and the U.S. at that time had concluded an invasion of the U.S. was highly unlikely and not happening. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who was the president then, he was kind of executive order happy. He issued a total of 3,721 of them. Many of them were to create his New Deal, which in and of itself was an executive order. Well, he issued Executive Order 9066, infamous because it forcibly relocated Japanese Americans to internment camps. They had to put up their businesses at fire sale rates, abandon them, same with their houses, their belongings, and they were sent to these internment camps. Now, many of these were first and second generation Americans, all of them here illegally. FDR's own Attorney General, Francis Biddle, initially opposed the order on the grounds that it would deprive Japanese Americans of their constitutional rights. He eventually relented to pressure from the military, and he supposedly regretted that decision the rest of his life. But you can imagine the kind of pressure that was put on him, given that the country had been attacked and was at war. Eventually, these camps held about 120,000 American citizens throughout World War II. Japanese Americans tried to volunteer to fight Japan, but they were initially barred from military service because they were considered to be enemy aliens when they were not. Eventually, exceptions were made. The 100th Infantry Battalion was created with all Japanese, and they adopted as their motto, quote, "Remember Pearl Harbor." They later merged with the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a combat team which garnered more military decorations than any other comparable group in U.S. military history. In 2001, President Clinton awarded 21 Medals of Honor to the 442nd, elevating many of their medals after studies. President Carter commissioned a study that found that they had been discriminated against in the awarding of the medals. These patriots, they fought in Europe because they weren't trusted to fight in the Pacific. They fought, died, even as their families and friends were incarcerated by the U.S. government. It took decades to try and recognize this wrong through apologies and reparations. Eventually, there was an apology from the U.S. government, and eventually reparations were authorized through decades-long fights to the U.S. Supreme Court, most notably the case of Korematsu versus the United States. These stories have been preserved. They've been reclaimed by so many. I think George Takei's play Allegiance comes to mind, and there have been many other earlier books dedicated to this as well. I'll name you a couple well-known ones: A Farewell to Manzanar, which was one of the internment camps, and the other one, a memoir called Only What We Could Carry, meaning literally they had to leave with only the belongings that they could carry. It's this interesting recent side note on Manzanar that they have redone the baseball field there and reopened it, and was very symbolic because while the Japanese Americans were incarcerated as Manzanar, they still wanted to play baseball because they felt that was a very American sport. They loved it, and they would play baseball there even as they were held against their will. But no mention of these sorts of cultural pieces of work, the art, the reclamation, is complete without one that sometimes is lesser known. It's very well known to Asian American literature scholars, but it's John Okada's book, No-No Boy. That was a novel about those Japanese Americans who refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, the country that was incarcerating them and their families. And some would go to prison and be disgraced for it. It's worth remembering because it's not uniform. People resist in their own ways, right? Like the Americans who went to Canada so as not to fight in Vietnam, like Muhammad Ali, who declared himself to be a conscientious objector with his famous quote that he had no quarrel with the Viet Cong. People can debate, were the No-No boys and Americans who went to Canada, were they cowards? Were they patriots? Some of both. Were the ones who fought, losing limbs, were they foolish to do that? Or were they heroes, or a bit of both? Those titles of those books I just put up for you and mentioned, they remind me of war stories, those titles. And because they are. They're the stories of the wars we all fight when faced with crises, wars of conscience. And that's what we all face now with this incoming regime. And that's what we here at Legal AF and Midas Touch, we're here to face it with you and collaborate with you, give you resources, talk about how we can do what's right. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Again, thank you so much for the replies and comments. Hard to keep up with all of them, but we'll talk to you soon.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.